Chapter 49. Dutiful Friendship. A great annual occasion has come round in the establishment of Mr. Matthew Bagnet, otherwise Lignum Vitae, ex-artilleryman and present bassoon-player. An occasion of feasting and festival, the celebration of a birthday in the family. It is not Mr. Bagnet's birthday. Mr. Bagnet merely distinguishes that epoch in the musical instrument business by kissing the children with an extra smack before breakfast, smoking an additional pipe after dinner, and wondering towards evening what his poor old mother is thinking about it, a subject of infinite speculation, and rendered so by his mother having departed this life 20 years. Some men rarely revert to their father, but seem in the bank books of their remembrance to have transferred all the stock of filial affection into their mother's name. Mr. Bagnet is one of these. Perhaps his exalted appreciation of the merits of the old girl causes him usually to make the noun substantive goodness of the feminine gender. It is not the birthday of one of the three children. Those occasions are kept with some marks of distinction, but they rarely overleap the bounds of happy returns and a pudding. On young Woolwich's last birthday Mr. Bagnet certainly did, after observing his growth and general advancement, proceed in a moment of profound reflection on the changes wrought by time, to examine him in the catechism, accomplishing with extreme accuracy the questions number 1 and 2, what is your name, and who gave you that name, but there failing in the exact precision of his memory, and substituting for number 3 the question, and how do you like that name, which he propounded with a sense of its importance in itself so edifying and improving as to give it quite an orthodox air. This, however, was a speciality on that particular birthday, and not a general solemnity. It is the old girl's birthday, and that is the greatest holiday and reddest letter day in Mr. Bagnet's calendar. The auspicious event is always commemorated according to certain forms settled and prescribed by Mr. Bagnet some years since. Mr. Bagnet, being deeply convinced that to have a pair of fowls for dinner is to attain the highest pitch of imperial luxury, invariably goes forth himself, very early in the morning of this day, to buy a pair. He is, as invariably, taken in by the vendor, and installed with the possession of the oldest inhabitants of any coop in Europe. Returning with these triumphs of toughness, tied up in a clean blue and white cotton handkerchief, essential to the arrangements, he in a casual manner invites Mrs. Bagnet to declare at breakfast what she would like for dinner. Mrs. Bagnet, by a coincidence never known to fail, replying fowls. Mr. Bagnet instantly produces his bundle from a place of concealment amidst general amazement and rejoicing. He further requires that the old girl shall do nothing all day long but sit in her very best gown and be served by himself and the young people. As he is not illustrious for his cookery, this may be supposed to be a matter of state rather than enjoyment on the old girl's part, but she keeps her state with all imaginable cheerfulness. On this present birthday Mr. Bagnet has accomplished the usual preliminaries. He has bought 2 specimens of poultry, which, if there be truth in the adages, were certainly not caught with chaff, to be prepared for the spit. He has amazed and rejoiced the family by their unlooked-for production. He is himself directing the roasting of the poultry, and Mrs. Bagnet, with her wholesome brown fingers itching to prevent what she sees going wrong, sits in her gown of ceremony, an honoured guest. Quebec and Malta lay the cloth for dinner, while Woolwich, serving as it beseems him under his father, keeps the fowls revolving. To these young scullions Mrs. Bagnet occasionally imparts a wink or a shake of the head or a crooked face as they made mistakes. At 1:30, says Mr. Bagnet, to the minute they'll be done. Mrs. Bagnet, with anguish, beholds one of them at a standstill before the fire and beginning to burn. You shall have a dinner, old girl, says Mr. Bagnet, fit for a queen. Mrs. Bagnet shows her white teeth cheerfully, but to the perception of her son betrays so much uneasiness of spirit that he is impelled by the dictates of affection to ask her, with his eyes, what is the matter. Thus, standing with his eyes wide open, more oblivious of the fowls than before, and not affording the least hope of a return to consciousness. Fortunately, his elder sister perceives the course of the agitation in Mrs. Bagnet's breast, and with an admonitory poke recalls him. The stock fowls going round again, Mrs. Bagnet closes her eyes in the intensity of her relief. "George will look us up," says Mr. Bagnet, "at 4:30. To the moment. How many years, old girl, has George looked us up?" "This afternoon." "Ah, lignum, lignum. As many as make an old woman of a young one. I begin to think just about that, and no less," returns Mrs. Bagnet, laughing and shaking her head. "Old girl," says Mr. Bagnet, "never mind. You'd be as young as you ever was if you weren't younger, which you are, as everybody knows." Quebec and Malta here exclaim, with clapping of hands, that Bluffy is sure to bring mother something, and begin to speculate on what it will be. "Do you know, lignum," says Mrs. Bagnet, casting a glance on the tablecloth and winking, "salt," at Malta with her right eye, and shaking the pepper away from Quebec with her head. "I begin to think George is in the roving way again." "George," returns Mr. Bagnet, "will never desert and leave his old comrade in the lurch. Don't be afraid of it." "No, lignum, no, I don't say he will. I don't think he will. But if he could get over this money trouble of his, I believe he would be off." Mr. Bagnet asks why. "Well," returns his wife, "considering George seems to be getting not a little impatient and restless, I don't say by what he's as free as ever. Of course he must be free, or he wouldn't be George. But he smarts and seems put out. He's extra drilled," says Mr. Bagnet, "by a lawyer who would put the devil out." "There's something in that," his wife assents. "But so it is, lignum." Further conversation is prevented for the time by the necessity under which Mr. Bagnet finds himself of directing the whole force of his mind to the dinner, which is a little endangered by the dry humour of the fowls in not yielding any gravy, and also by the made gravy acquiring no flavour and turning out of a flaxen complexion. With a similar perverseness, the potatoes crumble off forks in the process of peeling, upheaving from their centres in every direction, as if they were subject to earthquakes. The legs of the fowls, too, are longer than could be desired, and extremely scaly. Overcoming these disadvantages to the best of his ability, Mr. Bagnet at last dishes, and they sit down at the table, Mrs. Bagnet occupying the guest's place at his right hand. It is well for the old girl that she has but one birthday in a year, for two such indulgences in poultry might be injurious. Every kind of finer tendon and ligament that is in the nature of poultry to possess is developed in these specimens in the singular form of guitar strings. Their limbs appear to have struck roots into their breasts and bodies as aged trees strike roots into the earth. Their legs are so hard as to encourage the idea that they must have devoted the greater part of their long and arduous lives to pedestrian exercises and the walking of matches. But Mr. Bagnet, unconscious of these little defects, sets his heart on Mrs. Bagnet eating a most severe quantity of the delicacies before her. And as that good old girl would not cause him a moment of disappointment on any day, least of all on such a day, for any consideration, she imperils her digestion fearfully. How young Woolwich cleans the drumsticks without being of ostrich descent, his anxious mother is at a loss to understand. The old girl has another trial to undergo after the conclusion of the repast, in sitting in a state to see the room cleared, the hearth swept, and the dinner service washed up and polished in the backyard. The great delight and energy with which the two young ladies apply themselves to these duties, turning up their skirts in imitation of their mother, and skating in and out on little scaffolds of patterns, inspire the highest hopes for the future, but some anxiety for the present. The same causes lead to confusion of tongues, a clattering of crockery, a rattling of tin mugs, a whisking of brooms, and an expenditure of water, all in excess, while the saturation of the young ladies themselves is almost too moving a spectacle for Mrs. Bagnet to look upon with the calmness proper to her position. At last the various cleansing processes are triumphantly completed. Quebec and Malta appear in fresh attire, smiling and dry. Pipes and tobacco and something to drink are placed upon the table, and the old girl enjoys the first peace of mind she ever knows on the day of this delightful entertainment. When Mr. Bagnet takes his usual seat, the hands of the clock are very near to 4:30. As they mark it accurately, Mr. Bagnet announces, "George, military time." It is George, and he has hearty congratulations for the old girl, whom he kisses on the great occasion, and for the children, and for Mr. Bagnet. "Happy returns to you all," says Mr. George. "But, George, old man," cries Mrs. Bagnet, looking at him curiously, "what's come to you?" "Come to me? Ah, you're so white, George, for you, and you look so shocked. But only lignum." "George," says Mr. Bagnet, "tell the old girl what's the matter." "I didn't know I looked white," says the trooper, passing his hand over his brow, "and I didn't know I looked shocked, and I am sorry I do. But the truth is, that boy who was taken at my place died yesterday afternoon, and has rather knocked me over." "Poor creature," says Mrs. Bagnet, with a mother's pity. "Is he gone? Dear, dear." "I didn't mean to say anything about it, for it's not birthday talk. But you've got to get it out of me, you see, before I sit down." "I shall have roused up in a minute," says the trooper, making himself speak more gaily. "But you're so quick, Mrs. Bagnet." "You're right. The old girl," says Mr. Bagnet, "is as quick as powder. And what's more, she's the subject of the day, and we'll stick to her," cries Mr. George. "See here, I've brought a little brooch along with me. It's a poor thing, you know, but it's a keepsake. That's all the good it is, Mrs. Bagnet." Mr. George produces his present, which is greeted with admiring leapings and clappings by the young family, and with a species of reverential admiration by Mr. Bagnet. "Old girl," says Mr. Bagnet, "tell him my opinion of it." "Why, it's a wonder, George," says Mrs. Bagnet, exclaims. "It's the beautifullest thing that ever was seen." "Good," says Mr. Bagnet, "my opinion." "It's so pretty, George," cries Mrs. Bagnet, turning it on all sides and holding it out at arm's length, "that it seems too choice for me." "Bad," says Mr. Bagnet, "not my opinion." "But whatever it is, 100,000 thanks, old fellow," says Mrs. Bagnet, her eyes sparkling with pleasure, and her hand stretched out to him. "And though I have been a cross-grained soldier's wife to you sometimes, George, we are as strong friends, I am sure, in reality, as ever can be. Now you shall fasten it on yourself, for good luck, if you will, George." The children rose up to see it done, and Mr. Bagnet looks over young Woolwich's head to see it done with an interest so maturely wooden, yet pleasantly childish, that Mrs. Bagnet cannot help laughing in her airy way, and saying, "Oh, lignum, lignum, what a precious old chap you are." But the trooper fails to fasten the brooch. His hand shakes, he is nervous, and it falls off. "Would any one believe this?" says he, catching it as it drops and looking round. "I'm so out of sorts that I bungled an easy job like this." Mrs. Bagnet concludes that for such a case there is no remedy like a pipe, and fastening the brooch herself in a twinkling, causes the trooper to be inducted into his usual snug place, and the pipes to be got into action. "If that don't bring you round, George," says she, "just throw your eye across here at your present now and then, and the two together must do it." "You ought to do it of yourself," George answers. "I know that very well, Mrs. Bagnet. I'll tell you how, one way and another. The blues have got to be too many for me. Here was this poor lad. 'Twas dull work to see him dying as he did, and not being able to help him." "What do you mean, George? You did help him. You took him in under your roof." "I helped him so far, but that's little. I mean, Mrs. Bagnet, there he was dying without ever having been taught much more than to know his right hand from his left, and he was too far gone to be helped out of that." "Ah, poor creature," said Mrs. Bagnet. "Then," says the trooper, not yet lighting his pipe, and passing his heavy hand over his hair, "that brought up Gridley in a man's mind. He was a bad case too, in a different way. Then the two got mixed up in a man's mind with a flinty old rascal who had to do with both. And to think of that rusty carbine, stock and barrel, standing up on end in his corner hard, indifferent, taking everything so evenly, it made flesh and blood tingle, I do assure you." "My advice to you," returns Mrs. Bagnet, "is to light your pipe and tingle that way. It's wholesomer and comfortabler, and better for the health altogether." "You're right," says the trooper. "I'll do it." So he does it, though still with an indignant gravity that impresses the young Bagnets, and even causes Mr. Bagnet to defer the ceremony of drinking Mrs. Bagnet's health, always given by himself on these occasions in a speech of exemplary terseness. But the young ladies, having composed what Mr. Bagnet is in the habit of calling the mixture, and George's pipe being now in a glow, Mr. Bagnet considers it his duty to proceed to the toast of the evening. He addresses the assembled company in the following terms: George, Woolwich, Quebec, Malta, this is her birthday. Take a day's march, and you won't find such another. Here's towards her. The toast having been drunk with enthusiasm, Mrs. Bagnet returns thanks in a neat address of corresponding brevity. This model composition is limited to 3 words: "and wishing yours," which the old girl follows up with a nod to everybody in succession and a well-regulated swig of the mixture. This again she follows up on the present occasion by the wholly unexpected exclamation, "Here's a man!" Here is a man, much to the astonishment of the little company, looking in at the parlour door. He's a sharp-eyed man, a quick, keen man, and he takes in everybody's look at him all at once, individually and collectively, in a manner that stamps him a remarkable man. "George," says the man, nodding, "how do you find yourself?" "Why, it's Bucket!" cries Mr. George. "Yes," says the man, coming in and closing the door. "I was going down the street here when I happened to stop and look in at the musical instruments in the shop window. A friend of mine is in want of a second-hand violoncello of good tone, and I saw a party enjoying themselves, and I thought it was you in the corner. I thought I couldn't be mistaken. How goes the world with you, George, at the present moment? Pretty smooth? And with you, ma'am? And with you, governor? And Lord," says Mr. Bucket, opening his arms, "here's children too. You may do anything with me if you only show me children. Give us a kiss, my pets. No occasion to inquire who your father and mother is. Never saw such a likeness in me life." Mr. Bucket, not unwelcome, has sat himself down next to Mr. George, and has taken Quebec and Malta on his knees. "You pretty dears," says Mr. Bucket, "give us another kiss. It's the only thing I'm greedy in. Lord bless you, how healthy you look. And what might be the age of these 2, ma'am? I should put 'em down at the figures of about 8 and 10. "You're very near, sir," says Mrs. Bagnet. "I generally am near," returns Mr. Bucket, being so fond of children. "A friend of mine has had 19 of 'em, ma'am, all by one mother, and she's still as fresh and rosy as the morning. Not so much so as yourself, but upon my soul she comes near you. And what do you call these, my darling?" pursues Mr. Bucket, pinching Malta's cheek. "These are peaches. These are, bless your heart. And what do you think about father? Do you think father could recommend a second-hand violoncello of good tone for Mr. Bucket's friend, my dear? My name's Bucket. Ain't that a funny name?" These blandishments have entirely won the family heart. Mrs. Bagnet forgets the day to the extent of filling a pipe and a glass for Mr. Bucket, and waiting upon him hospitably. She would be glad to receive so pleasant a character under any circumstances, but she tells him that as a friend of George's she is particularly glad to see him this evening, for George has not been in his usual spirits. "Not in his usual spirits!" exclaims Mr. Bucket. "Why, I never heard of such a thing. What's the matter, George? You don't intend to tell me you've been out of spirits? What should you be out of spirits for? You haven't got anything on your mind, you know." "Nothing particular," returns the trooper. "I should think not," rejoins Mr. Bucket. "What could you have on your mind, you know?" "And have these pets got everything on their minds, sir? Not they. But they'll be upon the minds of some young fellows some of these days, and make 'em precious low-spirited. It ain't much of a profit, but I can tell you that, ma'am." Mrs. Bagnet, quite charmed, hopes Mr. Bucket has a family of his own. "There, ma'am," says Mr. Bucket, "would you believe it? No, I haven't. My wife and a lodger constitute my family. Mrs. Bucket is as fond of children as myself, and is wishful to have 'em. But no, so it is. Worldly goods are divided unequally, and man must not repine. What a very nice backyard, ma'am. Any way out of that yard now?" "There is no way out of that yard." "Ain't there really?" says Mr. Bucket. "I should have thought there might have been. Well, I don't know as I ever saw a backyard that took my fancy more. Would you allow me to look at it?" "Thank you. No, I see there's no way out. But what a very good proportioned yard it is." Having cast his sharp eye all about it, Mr. Bucket returns to his chair next to his friend, Mr. George, and pats Mr. George affectionately on the shoulder. "How are your spirits now, George?" "All right now," returns the trooper. "That's your sort," says Mr. Bucket. "Why should you ever have been otherwise? A man of your fine figure and constitution has no right to be out of spirits. That ain't a chest to be out of spirits, is it, ma'am? You haven't got anything on your mind, you know, George. What could you have on your mind?" Somewhat harping on this phrase, considering the extent and variety of his conversational powers, Mr. Bucket twice or thrice repeats it to the pipe he lights, and with a listening face that is particularly his own. But the sun of his sociality soon recovers from this brief eclipse and shines again. "And this is brother, is it, my dear?" says Mr. Bucket, referring to Quebec and Malta for information on the subject of young Woolwich. "And a nice brother he is, half brother I mean to say, for he's too old to be your boy, ma'am." "I can certify at all events that he's not anybody else's," returns Mrs. Bagnet, laughing. "Well, you do surprise me. Yet he's like you, there's no denying. Lord, he's wonderfully like you. But about what you may call the brow, you know, there his father comes out." Mr. Bucket compares the faces with one eye shut up, while Mr. Bagnet smokes in stolid satisfaction. This is an opportunity for Mrs. Bagnet to inform me that the boy is George's godson. "George's godson, is he?" rejoins Mr. Bucket with extreme cordiality. "I must shake hands over again with George's godson." Godfather and godson do credit to one another. And what do you intend to make of him, ma'am? Does he show any turn for musical instrument? Mr. Bagnet suddenly interposes. "Plays the fife beautiful." "Would you believe it, governor," says Mr. Bucket, struck by the coincidence, "that when I was a boy I played the fife myself? Not in a scientific way, as I expect he does, but by ear, Lord bless you. British Grenadiers, there's a tune to warm an Englishman up. Could you give us British Grenadiers, my fine fellow?" Nothing can be more acceptable to the little circle than this call upon young Woolwich, who immediately fetches his fife and performs a stirring melody, during which performance Mr. Bucket, much enlivened, beats time, and never fails to come in sharp with the burden, "British Grenadiers." In short, he shows so much musical taste that Mr. Bagnet actually takes his pipe from his lips to express his conviction that he is a singer. Mr. Bucket receives the harmonious impeachment so modestly, confessing how that he did once chaunt a little for the expression of the feelings of his own bosom, and with no presumptuous idea of entertaining his friends. That he is asked to sing, not to be behindhand in the sociality of the evening, he complies, and gives them "Believe Me, if all those endearing young charms." This ballad, he informs Mrs. Bagnet, he considers to have been his most powerful ally in moving the heart of Mrs. Bucket when a maiden, and introducing her to approach the altar. Mr. Bucket's own words are, "to come up to the scratch." This sparkling stranger is such a new and agreeable feature of the evening that Mr. George, who testified no great emotions of pleasure on his entrance, begins, in spite of himself, to be rather proud of him. He is so friendly, is a man of so many resources, easy to get on with, that it is something to have made him known there. Mr. Bagnet becomes, after another pipe, so sensible of the value of his acquaintance that he solicits the honour of his company for the old girl's next birthday. If anything can more closely cement and consolidate the esteem which Mr. Bucket has formed for the family, it is the discovery of the nature of the occasion. He drinks to Mrs. Bagnet with a warmth approaching to rapture, engages himself for that day 12 months more, and thankfully makes a memorandum of the day in a large black pocket book with a girdle to it, and breathes a hope that Mrs. Bucket and Mrs. Bagnet may before then become, in a manner, sisters, as he says himself. What is public life without private ties? He is in his humble way a public man, but it is not in that sphere that he finds happiness. No, it must be sought within the confines of domestic bliss. It is natural under these circumstances that he, in his turn, should remember the friend to whom he is indebted for so promising an acquaintance, and he does. He keeps very close to him. Whatever the subject of the conversation, he keeps a tender eye upon him. He waits to walk home with him. He is interested in his very boots, and observes them attentively as Mr. George sits smoking cross-legged in the chimney corner. At length Mr. George rises to depart. At the same moment Mr. Bucket, with the secret sympathy of friendship, also rises. He dotes upon the children to the last, and remembers the commission he has undertaken for an absent friend. "Respecting that second-hand violoncello, governor, could you recommend me such a thing?" "Scores," says Mr. Bagnet. "I'm obliged to you," returns Mr. Bucket, squeezing his hand. "You're a friend in need. A good tone, mind you. My friend is a regular dab at it, ecod. He saws away at Mozart and Handel, and the rest of the bigwigs like a thorough work. And you needn't, says Mr. Bucket in a considerate and private voice, you needn't commit yourself to too low a figure, governor. I don't want to pay too large a price for my friend, but I want you to have your proper percentage and be remunerated for your loss of time. That is but fair. Every man must live, and ought to it. Mr. Bagnet shakes his head at the old girl to the effect that they have found a jewel of price. Suppose I was to give you a look in, say, 10:30 tomorrow morning. Perhaps you could name the figures of a few violoncellos of good tone, says Mr. Bucket. Nothing easier. Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet both engage to have the requisite information ready, and even hint to each other at the practicability of having a small stock collected there for approval. Thank you, says Mr. Bucket. Thank you. Good night, ma'am. Good night, governor. Good night, darlings. I am much obliged to you for one of the pleasantest evenings I have ever spent in my life. They, on the contrary, are much obliged to him for the pleasure he has given them in his company, and so they part with many expressions of goodwill on both sides. Now, George, old boy, says Mr. Bucket, taking his arm at the shop door, come along. As they go down the little street, and the Bagnets pause for a minute looking after them, Mrs. Bagnet remarks to the worthy Lignum that Mr. Bucket almost clings to George like, and seems to be really fond of him. The neighbouring streets being narrow and ill paved, it is a little inconvenient to walk there two abreast and arm in arm. Mr. George therefore soon proposes to walk singly, but Mr. Bucket, who cannot make up his mind to relinquish his friendly hold, replies, "Wait half a minute, George. I should wish to speak to you first." Immediately afterwards he twists him into a public house and into a parlour, where he confronts him and claps his own back against the door. "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, "duty is duty, and friendship is friendship. I never want the two to clash if I can help it. I've endeavoured to make things pleasant tonight, and I put it to you whether I've done it or not. You must consider yourself in custody, George." "Custody? What for?" returns the trooper, thunderstruck. "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, urging a sensible view of the case upon him with his fat forefinger, "duty, as you know very well, is one thing, and conversation is another. It is my duty to inform you that any observations you make will be liable to be used against you. Therefore, George, be careful what you say. You don't happen to have heard of a murder?" "Murder?" "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, keeping his forefinger in an impressive state of action, "bear in mind what I've said to you. I ask you nothing. You've been in low spirits this afternoon, I say. You don't happen to have heard of a murder?" "No. Where has there been a murder?" "Now, George," says Mr. Bucket, "don't you go and commit yourself. I'm going to tell you what I want you for. There's been a murder in Lincoln's Inn Fields. A gentleman, the name of Tulkinghorn. He was shot last night. I want you for that." The trooper sinks upon a seat behind him, and great drops start out upon his forehead, and a deadly pallor overspreads his face. "Bucket, it's not possible that Mr. Tulkinghorn has been killed, and that you suspect me." "George," returns Mr. Bucket, keeping his forefinger going, "it is certainly possible, because it is the case. The deed was done last night at 10 o'clock. Now you know where you were last night at 10 o'clock, and you'll be able to prove it, no doubt." Last night," repeats the trooper thoughtfully. Then it flashes upon him, "Why, great heaven, I was there last night." "So I have understood, George," returns Mr. Bucket with great deliberation. "So I have understood. Likewise, you've been very often there. You've been seen hanging around the place, and you've been heard more than once in a wrangle with him. And it's possible, I don't say it's certainly so, mind you, but it's possible that he may have been heard to call you a threatening, murdering, dangerous fellow." The trooper gasps, as if he would admit it all if he could speak. "Now, George," continues Mr. Bucket, putting his hat upon the table with an air of business, rather in the upholstery way than otherwise, "my wish is, as it has been all the evening, to make things pleasant. I'll tell you plainly, there's a reward out of 100 guineas offered by Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. You and me have always been pleasant together, but I have got a duty to discharge, and if that 100 guineas is to be made, it may as well be made by me as any other man. On all of which accounts, I should hope it was clear to you that I must have you, that I'm damned if I don't have you. I am to call in any assistance, or is the trick done?" Mr. George has recovered himself and stands up like a soldier. Come, says he, I am ready. George, continues Mr. Bucket, wait a bit. With his upholsterer manner, as if the trooper were a window to be fitted up, he takes from his pocket a pair of handcuffs. This is a serious charge, George, and such is my duty. The trooper flushes angrily and hesitates a moment, but holds out his two hands clasped together and says, There, put them on. Mr. Bucket adjusts them in a moment. How do you find them? Are they comfortable? If not, say so, for I wish to make things as pleasant as is consistent with my duty, and I've got another pair in my pocket. This remark he offers like a most respectable tradesman anxious to execute an order neatly and to the perfect satisfaction of his customer. They'll do as they are? Very well. Now you see, George. He takes a cloak from the corner and begins adjusting it about the trooper's neck. I was mindful of your feelings when I came out, and brought this on purpose. There, who's the wiser? Only I, returns the trooper, but as I know it, do me one more good turn, and pull my hat over my eyes. Really, though, do you mean it? Ain't it a pity? It looks so... I can't look chance men in the face with these things on, Mr. George hurriedly replies. Do for God's sake pull my hat forward. So strongly entreated, Mr. Bucket complies, puts his own hat on, conducts his prize into the streets, the trooper marching on as steadily as usual, though with his head less erect, and Mr. Bucket steering him with his elbow over the crossings and up the turnings. Chapter 50. Esther's Narrative. It happened that when I came home from Deal, I found a note from Caddy Jellyby, as we always continued to call her, informing me that her health, which had been for some time very delicate, was worse, and that she would be more glad than she could tell me if I would go to see her. It was a note of a few lines, written from the couch on which she lay, and enclosed to me in another from her husband, in which he seconded her entreaty with much solicitude. Caddy was now the mother, and I the godmother, of such a poor little baby, such a tiny, old-faced mite, with a countenance that seemed to be scarcely anything but cap border, and a little lean, long-fingered hand always clenched under its chin. It would lie in this attitude all day, with its bright specks of eyes open, wondering, as I used to imagine, how it came to be so small and weak. Whenever it was moved, it cried, but at all other times it was so patient that the sole desire of its life appeared to be lie quiet and think. It had a curious little dark veins in its face, and curious little dark marks under its eyes, like faint remembrances of poor Caddy's inky days, and altogether, to those who were not used to it, it was quite a piteous little sight. But it was enough for Caddy that she used to it. The projects with which she beguiled her illness, for little Esther's education, and little Esther's marriage, and even for her old age as the grandmother of little Esther's, was so prettily expressive of devotion to this pride of her life, that I should be tempted to recall some of them but for the timely remembrance that I am getting on irregularly as it is. To return to the letter, Caddy had a superstition about me which had been strengthening in her mind ever since that night long ago when she had lain asleep with her head in my lap. She almost, I think I must say, quite believed that I did her good whenever I was near her. Now, although this was such a fancy of the affectionate girl's that I am almost ashamed to mention it, still it might have all the force of a fact when she was really ill. Therefore I set off to Caddy with my guardian's consent, post haste, and she and Prince made so much of me that there was never anything like it. The next day I went again to sit with her, and the next day I went again. It was a very easy journey, for I only had to rise a little earlier in the morning and keep my accounts and tend to the housekeeping matters before leaving home. But when I had made these 3 visits, my guardian said to me on my return at night, Now, little woman, this will never do. Constant dropping will wear away a stone, and constant coaching will wear out a Dame Durden. We will go to London for a while and take possession of our old lodgings. Not for me, dear guardian, said I, for I never feel tired, which was strictly true. I was only too happy to be in such request. For me, then, returned my guardian, or for Ada, or for both of us. It is somebody's birthday tomorrow, I think. Truly, I think it is, I said, kissing my darling, who would be 21 tomorrow. Well, observed my guardian, half pleasantly, half seriously, that's a great occasion, and will give my fair cousin some necessary business to transact in assertion of her independence, and will make London a more convenient place for all of us. So to London we will go. That being settled, there is another thing. How have you left Caddy? Very unwell, guardian. I fear it will be some time before she regains her health and strength. What do you call some time now? Asked my guardian thoughtfully. Some weeks, I'm afraid. Ah, he began to walk about the room with his hands in his pockets, showing that he had been thinking as much. Now, what do you say about her doctor? Is he a good doctor, my love? I felt obliged to confess that I knew nothing to the contrary, but the Prince and I had agreed only that evening that we would like his opinion to be confirmed by someone. Well, you know, returned my guardian quickly, there's Woodcourt. I had not meant that, and was rather taken by surprise. For a moment all that I had in my mind in connection with Mr. Woodcourt seemed to come back and confuse me. You don't object to him, little woman? Object to him, guardian? Oh, no. And you don't think the patient would object to him? So far from that, I had no doubt of her being prepared to have a great reliance on him, and to like him very much. I said that he was no stranger to her personally, for she had seen him often in his kind attendance on Miss Flite. Very good, said my guardian. He's been here to-day, my dear, and I will see him about it to-morrow. I felt in this short conversation, although I did not know how, for she was quiet, and we interchanged no look, that my dear girl well remembered how merrily she had clasped me round the waist when no other hands than Caddy's had brought me the little parting token. This caused me to feel that I ought to tell her, and Caddy too, that I was going to be the mistress of Bleak House, and that if I avoided that disclosure any longer, I might become less worthy in my own eyes of its master's love. Therefore, when we went upstairs and had waited listening until the clock struck 12, in order that I only might be the first to wish my darling all good wishes on her birthday, and take her to my heart, I set before her, just as I had set before myself, the goodness and honour of her cousin John, and the happy life that was in store for me. If ever my darling were fonder of me at one time than another in all our intercourse, she was surely fondest of me that night. I was so rejoiced to know it, and so comforted by the sense of having done right in casting this last idle reservation away, that I was 10 times happier than I had been before. I had scarcely thought it a reservation a few hours ago, but now that it was gone I felt as if I understood its nature better. The next day we went to London. We found our old lodging vacant, and in half an hour were quietly established there, as if we had never gone away. Mr. Woodcourt dined with us to celebrate my darling's birthday, and we were as pleasant as we could be with the great blank amongst us that Richard's absence naturally made on such an occasion. After that day I was for some weeks, 8 or 9 as I remember, very much with Caddy, and thus it fell out that I saw less of Ada at this time than any other since we had first come together, except the time of my own illness. She often came to Caddy's, but our function there was to amuse and cheer her, and we did not talk in our usual confidential manner. Whenever I went home at night we were together, but Caddy's rest was broken by pain, and I often remained to nurse her. With her husband and her poor little mite of a baby to love, and their home to strive for, what a good creature Caddy was! So self-denying, so uncomplaining, so anxious to get well on their account, so afraid of giving trouble, and so thoughtful of the unassisted labours of her husband and the comforts of old Mr. Turveydrop. I had never known the best of her until now, and it seemed so curious that her pale face and helpless figure should be lying there day after day, where dancing was the business of life, where the kit and the apprentices began early every morning in the ballroom, and where the untidy little boy waltzed by himself in the kitchen all afternoon. At Caddy's request I took the supreme direction of her apartment, trimmed it up, and pushed her, couch and all, into a lighter, more airy and more cheerful corner that she had not yet occupied. Then every day, when we were in our neatest array, I used to lay my small namesake in her arms, and sit down and chat or work or read to her. It was one of the first of these quiet times that I told Caddy about Bleak House. We had other visitors besides Ada. First of all we had Prince, who in his hurried intervals of teaching used to come softly in and sit softly down with a face of loving anxiety for Caddy and the very little child. Whatever Caddy's condition really was, she never failed to declare to Prince that she was all but well, which, heaven forgive me, never failed to confirm. This would put Prince in such good spirits that he would sometimes take the kit from his pocket and play a chord or two to astonish the baby, which I never knew it to do in the least degree, for my tiny namesake never even noticed it at all. Then there was Mrs. Jellyby. She would come occasionally with her usual distraught manner, and sit calmly looking miles beyond her grandchild, as if her attention were absorbed by young Borrioboolan on its native shores. As bright as ever, as serene and untidy, she would say, "Well, Caddy, child, and how do you do today?" and then would sit amiably smiling and taking no notice of the reply, or would sweetly glide off into a calculation of the number of letters she had lately received and answered, or of the coffee-bearing power of Borrioboola Gha. This she would always do with serene contempt for our limited sphere of action, not to be disguised. Then there was old Mr. Turveydrop, who was from morning to night and from night to morning the subject of innumerable precautions. If the baby cried, it was nearly stifled, lest the noise should make him uncomfortable. If the fire wanted stirring in the night, it was surreptitiously done, lest his rest should be broken. If Caddy required any little comfort that the house contained, she first carefully discussed whether he was likely to require it too. In return for this consideration, he would come into the room once a day, all but blessing it, showing a condescension, a patronage, and a grace of manner in dispensing the light of his high-shouldered presence, from which I might have supposed him, if I had not known better, to have been the benefactor of Caddy's life. "My Caroline," he would say, making the nearest approach that he could to bending over her, "tell me that you are better to-day." Much better, thank you, Mr. Turveydrop," Caddy would reply. "Delighted, enchanted. And our dear Miss Summerson, she's not quite prostrated by fatigue." Here he would crease up his eyelids and kiss his fingers to me, though I am happy to say he had ceased to be particular in his attentions since I had been so altered. "Not at all," I would assure him. "Charming. We must take care of our dear Caroline, Miss Summerson. We must spare nothing that will restore her. We must nourish her. My dear Caroline," he would turn to his daughter-in-law with infinite generosity and protection, "want for nothing, my love. Frame a wish and gratify it, my daughter. Everything this house contains, everything my room contains, is at your service, my dear. Do not," he would sometimes add in a burst of deportment, "even allow my simple requirements to be considered if they should at any time interfere with your own, my Caroline. Your necessities are greater than mine." He had established such a long prescriptive right to this deportment, his son's inheritance from his mother, that I several times knew both Caddy and her husband to be melted to tears by these affectionate self-sacrifices. "Nay, my dears," he would remonstrate, and when I saw Caddy's thin arm about his fat neck as he said it, I would be melted too, though not by the same process. "Nay, nay, I have promised never to leave ye. Be dutiful and affectionate towards me, and I ask no other return. Now bless ye, I am going to the park." He would take the air there presently and get an appetite for his hotel dinner. I hope I do old Mr. Turveydrop no wrong, but I never saw any better traits in him than these, I faithfully record, except that he certainly conceived a liking for Peepy, and would take the child out walking with great pomp, always on these occasions sending him home before he went to dinner himself, and occasionally with a halfpenny in his pocket. But even this disinterestedness was attended with no inconsiderable cost to my knowledge, for before Peepy was sufficiently decorated to walk hand in hand with the Professor of Deportment, he had to be newly dressed at the expense of Caddy and her husband from top to toe. The last of our visitors was Mr. Jellyby. Really, when he used to come in of an evening and ask Caddy in his meek voice how she was, and then sit down with his head against the wall and make no attempt to say anything more, I liked him very much. If he had found me bustling about doing any little thing, he sometimes half took his coat off, as with an intention of helping by a great exertion. But he never got any further. His sole occupation was to sit with his head against the wall, looking hard at the thoughtful baby, and I could not quite divest my mind of a fancy that they understood one another. I have not counted Mr. Woodcourt amongst our visitors, because he was now Caddy's regular attendant. She soon began to improve under his care, but he was so gentle, so skilful, so unwearying in the pains he took, that it was not to be wondered at, I am sure. I saw a great deal of Mr. Woodcourt during this time, though not so much as might be supposed, for knowing Caddy to be safe in his hands. I often slipped home at about the hours when he was expected. We frequently met, notwithstanding. I was quite reconciled to myself now, but I still felt glad to think that he was sorry for me. And he still was sorry for me, I believed. He helped Mr. Badger in his professional engagements, which were numerous, and had as yet no settled projects for the future. It was when Caddy began to recover that I began to notice a change in my dear girl. I cannot say how it first presented itself to me, because I observed it in many slight particulars which were nothing in themselves, and only became something when they were pieced together. But I made it out by putting them together, that Ada was not so frankly cheerful with me as she used to be. Her tenderness for me was as loving and true as ever. I did not for a moment doubt that, but there was a quiet sorrow about her which she did not confide to me, and in which I traced some hidden regret. Now I could not understand this, and I was anxious for the happiness of my own pet, that it caused me some uneasiness and set me thinking often. At length, feeling sure that Ada suppressed this something from me, lest it should make me unhappy too, it came into my head that she was a little grieved, for me, by what I had told her about Bleak House. How I persuaded myself that this was likely, I don't know. I had no idea that there were any selfish reference in my doing so. I was not grieved for myself. I was quite contented and quite happy. Still, that Ada might be thinking for me, though I had abandoned all such thoughts of what once was, but was now all changed, seemed so easy to believe that I believed it. What could I do to reassure my darling, I considered then, and show her that I had no such feelings? Well, I could only be as brisk and busy as possible, and that I had tried to be all along. However, as Caddy's illness had certainly interfered more or less with my home duties, though I had always been there in the morning to make my guardian's breakfast, and he had 100 times laughed and said there must be 2 little women, for his little woman was never missing, I resolved to be doubly diligent and gay. So I went about the house humming all the tunes I knew. I sat working and working in a desperate manner, and I talked and talked morning, noon, and night. And still there was the same shade between me and my darling. "So, Dame Trot," observed my guardian, shutting up his book one night when we were all 3 together, "so Woodcourt has restored Caddy Jellyby to the full enjoyment of life again." "Yes," I said, "and to be repaid by such gratitude as hers is to be made rich, guardian." "I wish it was," he returned, "with all my heart." So did I too, for that matter. I said so. Aye, we would make him as rich as a Jew if we knew how. Would we not, little woman? I laughed as I worked, and replied that I was not sure about that, for it might spoil him, and he might not be so useful, and there might be many who could ill spare him, as Miss Flite and Caddy herself, and many others. "True," said my guardian, "I had forgotten that, but we would agree to make him rich enough to live, I suppose, rich enough to work with tolerable peace of mind, rich enough to have his own happy home and his own household gods, and household goddess too, perhaps." "That was quite another thing," I said. "We must all agree in that." "To be sure," said my guardian, "all of us. I have a great regard for Woodcourt, a high esteem for him, and I have been sounding him delicately about his plans. It is difficult to offer aid to an independent man with that just kind of pride which he possesses, and yet I would be glad to do it if I might, or if I knew how. He seems half inclined for another voyage, but that appears like casting such a man away." "It might open a new world to him," said I. "So it might, little woman," my guardian assented. "I doubt if he expects much of the old world. Do you know, I have fancied that he sometimes feels some particular disappointment or misfortune encountered in it. You never heard of anything of that sort?" I shook my head. Said my guardian. "I'm mistaken, I dare say." And there was a little pause here, which I thought, for my dear girl's satisfaction, had better be filled up. I hummed an air as I worked, which was a favourite with my guardian. "And do you think Mr. Woodcourt will make another voyage?" I asked him, when I had hummed it quietly all through. "I don't quite know what to think, my dear, but I should say it was likely at present, and that he will give a long trip to another country." "I'm sure he will take the best wishes of all our hearts with him wherever he goes," said I. "And though they are not riches, he will never be the poorer for them, guardian, at least." "Never, little woman," he replied. I was sitting in my usual place, which was now beside my guardian's chair. That had not been my usual place before the letter, but it was now. I looked up to Ada, who was sitting opposite, and I saw as she looked at me that her eyes were filled with tears, and that tears were falling down her face. I felt that I had only to be placid and merry once for all to undeceive my dear and set her loving heart at rest. I really was so, and I had nothing to do but to be myself. So I made my sweet girl lean upon my shoulder, how little thinking what was heavy on her mind. And I said she was not quite well, and put my arm about her and took her upstairs. When we were in our own room, and when she might perhaps have told me what I was so unprepared to hear, I gave her no encouragement to confide in me. I never thought she stood in need of it. "Oh, my dear good Esther," said Ada, "if only I could make up my mind to speak to you and my cousin John when you are together." "Why, my love," I remonstrated. "Ada, why should you not speak to us?" Ada only dropped her head and pressed me closer to her heart. "You surely don't forget, my beauty," said I, smiling, "what quiet, old-fashioned people we are, and how I have settled down to be the discreetest of dames. You don't forget how happily and peacefully my life is all marked out for me, and by whom. I am certain you don't forget by what a noble character, Ada. That can never be." "No, never, Esther." "Why then, my dear," said I, "there can be nothing amiss, and why should you not speak to us?" "Nothing amiss, Esther," returned Ada. "Oh, when I think of all these years, and of his fatherly care and kindness, and of the old relations among us, and of you, what shall I do? What shall I do?" I looked at my child in some wonder, but I thought it better not to answer otherwise than by cheering her. So I turned off into many little recollections of our life together, and prevented her from saying more. When she lay down to sleep, and not before, I returned to my guardian to say good night, and then I came back to Ada and sat near her for a little while. She was asleep, and I thought as I looked at her she was a little changed. I had thought so more than once lately. I could not decide, even looking at her while she was unconscious, how she was changed. Something in the familiar beauty of her face looked different to me. My guardian's old hopes of her and Richard arose sorrowfully in my mind, and I said to myself, "She's been anxious about him." I wondered how that love would end. When I had come home from Caddy's while she was ill, I had often found Ada at work. She had always put her work away, and I had never known what it was. Some of it now lay in a drawer near her, which was not quite closed. I did not open the drawer, but I still rather wondered what the work could be, for it was evidently nothing for herself. And I noticed as I kissed my dear that she lay with one hand under a pillow, so that it was hidden. How much less amiable I must have been than they thought me. How much less amiable than I thought myself, to be so preoccupied with my own cheerfulness and contentment as to think that it only rested with me to put my dear girl right and set her mind at peace. But I lay down, self-deceived in that belief, and I awoke in it next day to find there was still the same shade between me and my darling.